The November fog and an unexpected visitor. The autumn of 1894 had descended upon London with particular malevolence, wrapping the great metropolis in a shroud of fog so dense that even the familiar gas lamps of Baker Street appeared as mere suggestions of light, ghostly orbs suspended in the murky darkness. It was on such an evening, when the very air seemed to press against our windows with yellow, sullen persistence, that one of the most perplexing cases in my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes began to unfold. I'd returned to our lodgings at 220 B after an evening lecture at the Royal Society of Medicine, my mind still occupied with the fascinating discourse on tropical diseases I had just witnessed. The warmth of our sitting room provided a welcome contrast to the damp chill outside, where the fire crackled merrily in the grate and cast dancing shadows across the familiar Persian rug. Holmes was seated in his accustomed armchair, his long, angular frame wrapped in his mouse-colored dressing gown, engaged in cross-referencing the agony columns of several newspapers with a formidable index he had been compiling. "Watson," he remarked suddenly, without lifting his eyes from the newsprint, "I perceive that your patience with those new boots is wearing thin. I would advise applying a mixture of beeswax and turpentine to the instep. It softens the leather far more effectively than mere polish." I lowered my evening paper, accustomed as I was to his startling deductions, yet forever marveling at their precision. "My dear Holmes, I have not complained of them once this evening. How on earth could you know?" "Elementary, my good doctor," he replied, finally looking up with that familiar glimmer of intellectual satisfaction in his grey eyes. "You have shifted your position in that chair no fewer than 4 times in the last 10 minutes, each time favoring your left side. Furthermore, when you crossed to the sideboard for the brandy, your stride was distinctly uneven, a slight hesitation on the right foot indicative of pressure at the toe. Since those boots bear the distinctive stitching of Latimer's on Oxford Street, and I observed you making that purchase yesterday, it follows that the breaking-in period is proving disagreeable." The mysterious telegrams. Our discourse was interrupted by the familiar sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stair, followed by her gentle rap upon the door. She entered bearing her silver tray, upon which rested not one but 3 pale blue envelopes. "Telegrams for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her voice carrying a note of concern. "They arrived within the space of 2 hours, each marked more urgent than the last. The final messenger is waiting below for a reply." Holmes sprang from his chair with sudden energy, his lethargy vanishing in an instant. He snatched up the telegrams, his keen eyes scanning each message with the intensity of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. A moment later, he let out a low whistle and tossed all 3 papers across to me. "Read those, Watson, in chronological order. It seems our evening's tranquility is to be thoroughly disrupted." I arranged the telegrams by their timestamps and read them aloud. The first sent at 7 o'clock. "Mr. Holmes, Stop require your assistance in matter of utmost urgency. Stop will call upon you this evening. Stop Josiah, Farquhar. Stop Chief Clerk, Midland Railway, St. Pancras Station. Stop." The second, arriving at 8:30. "Mr. Holmes, stop cannot leave station. Stop situation, deteriorating. Stop strange occurrences below ground. Stop beg you attend at once. Stop Farquhar. Stop." The third and final message, received mere minutes before my arrival. "Mr. Holmes, stop, they will not believe me. Stop, something moves in the darkness. Stop, a man is dead. Stop, for God's sake, come quickly. Stop, Farquhar, stop." "Good heavens," I murmured, feeling that familiar chill which had nothing to do with the November weather. The progression from professional courtesy to barely controlled panic is unmistakable. "What do you make of it?" Holmes had already begun pacing the room, his movements quick and precise. "I make several observations, Watson. First, note that Mr. Farquhar identifies himself as Chief Clerk of the Midland Railway, a position requiring methodical thinking and administrative precision. Such a man would not summon a consulting detective without first exhausting conventional channels. Second, observe his phrase, "They will not believe me." suggesting he has already reported these occurrences to his superiors or to Scotland Yard. Third, and most significantly, his final message speaks of death. The arrival of Mr. Farquhar. Even as Holmes spoke, we heard the sound of heavy footsteps upon the stairs, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice and that of another man. A moment later, our landlady appeared once more, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Farquhar to see you, sir," she announced, stepping aside to admit our visitor. He entered at once, a tall, spare gentleman wrapped in a grey ulster coat, the collar turned up to his ears despite the warmth of our room. The garment was spattered with what I initially took for common mud, but which, when he stepped fully into the gaslight, revealed itself as a fine, rust-coloured grit unlike anything I'd seen in London streets. His soft felt hat he clutched between long, nervous fingers, and his face, pallid and ascetic, was framed by iron-grey whiskers that trembled slightly as he inclined his head first to me and then to Holmes. My friend had already risen from his chair, and I could see from the faint suggestion of amusement that touched his thin lips that he had not been wholly absorbed in his newspapers. "Pray be seated, Mr. Farquhar," Holmes said with characteristic directness. "You have come to consult me regarding a matter at St. Pancras Station, and if I am not in error, that matter has already claimed one life and threatens, in your estimation, to claim another." Our visitor started so violently that his hat tumbled from his fingers and rolled to rest against the fender. "Good Lord," he ejaculated, his voice hoarse with strain. "Then the rumors of your powers were not exaggerated, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes waved one hand in gentle deprecation. "Rumor is a pernicious thing, sir. I observed merely the particular dust upon the hem of your coat. Volcanic in character, easily distinguishable from ordinary London mud. There is only one place in our vicinity where such residue could be acquired in that quantity, the excavations and furnace works below the main platforms at St. Pancras, where the Midland Railway has been effecting certain alterations to the substructure. The inkstains upon your right cuff indicate clerical occupation, while the railway company's identification tag upon your watch chain confirms your connection with the Midland line. As for the rest, well, your telegrams speak for themselves, and the evening papers have carried reports of a mysterious occurrence at the station. The tale of the impossible. Door. Mr. Farquhar sank into the proffered chair as if his legs had failed him entirely. "You are perfectly correct in all particulars, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have come to you because I do not know where else to turn. Scotland Yard has examined the matter. Inspector Lestrade himself was at the station this morning. Yet they all say it is merely an unfortunate accident. I tell you, Mr. Holmes, it is nothing of the sort." Holmes settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "That is a grave assertion, Mr. Farquhar. Pray state the facts in your own words. Begin as far back as you deem necessary, but omit nothing that may appear trivial. It is often the smallest detail that yields the most significant revelation." Farquhar pressed a handkerchief to his lips for a moment, as if to steady himself, then began his remarkable tale. "You must understand, gentlemen, that St. Pancras is not merely a railway station. It is a city unto itself. Passengers see only the grand hotel, the soaring iron and glass of the train shed, the familiar bustle of platforms and waiting rooms. They do not see the world that exists beneath. The coal faces, the storage vaults, the labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers that extend for acres under the platforms like some vast catacomb. I have served the Midland Railway for nearly 30 years, and even now there are corridors down there I have never explored." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he continued. "Of late, there have been disturbing reports from the men working below. Whispers of sounds in the disused tunnels during the night hours. Scraping, tapping, as if someone were signaling in code. Tools mislaid and discovered in impossible locations. Shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. At first, I dismissed these as the natural fancies of men working in such an environment. The echoes and drafts in those depths would make anyone's imagination run wild. But then came the matter of Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, our senior surveyor. 3 weeks ago, he reported to me a discovery that defied all explanation. While examining some old maintenance shafts near the western foundation wall, he had encountered a door, a heavy oak door set into the original brickwork that appeared on none of our architectural plans. It bore no handle or obvious means of opening, but featured a peculiar iron plate in its center, shaped like a cross within a circle. Holmes's fingers, which had been resting quietly in his lap, stiffened almost imperceptibly. A cross within a circle, you say? Most intriguing. Continue. Penhaligon swore he could hear sounds from behind that door, faint scraping as if someone were dragging heavy objects across stone. When he called out, the sounds ceased immediately. He reported this to his foreman, but the man laughed and suggested Penhaligon had been sampling too much of the beer stored in the adjacent vaults. Farquhar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But Penhaligon was not a man given to fancy, Mr. Holmes. He was methodical, precise, a man who measured twice and cut once, as they say. When he came to me requesting access to the original construction records, I could see the matter had genuinely disturbed him. "It is as if the station has grown a new limb," he told me, "something that ought not to be there." "And what did your investigation of the records reveal?" Holmes inquired. "Nothing, sir. Absolutely nothing. Our architectural plans date back to 1867, when construction began, and they show no such door. I even consulted the original geological surveys. Nothing. It was as if this door had simply appeared." The fatal discovery. Farquhar's composure, already strained, began to crumble entirely as he reached the climax of his account. Last night, shortly after the midnight mail had departed, a porter named Briggs heard a cry from the western tunnels, a single, terrible cry that echoed through the vaults like the voice of the damned. He raised the alarm immediately, and several men went below with lanterns. The clerk's hands were now shaking uncontrollably. They found Penhaligon's body at the bottom of a maintenance shaft, a fall of nearly 30 feet onto solid stone. His neck was broken, his skull. He swallowed heavily. Inspector Lestrade examined the scene and concluded that poor Penhaligon had simply lost his footing in the darkness and plunged to his death. An unfortunate accident, nothing more. "But you believe otherwise?" Holmes observed quietly. "I know otherwise, sir. Penhaligon's lamp was found at the top of the shaft, still burning, placed neatly upon the flagstones as if set down by deliberate hand. His measuring chain lay coiled beside it with mathematical precision, and there were marks in the dust at the edge. Scuff, marks as if there had been some kind of struggle." Farquhar reached into his inner pocket with trembling fingers and withdrew a small object wrapped in brown paper. "There is one more thing, Mr. Holmes. When they brought Penhaligon up from the shaft, they found this clutched so tightly in his right hand that the surgeon had difficulty prying his fingers apart. He unwrapped the paper to reveal a fragment of stone unlike anything I had ever seen. It was black as pitch, yet possessed a peculiar oily sheen that caught the firelight in disturbing, iridescent swirls. There was something profoundly unsettling about the object, an indefinable quality that seemed to whisper of great age and darker purposes. Holmes took the fragment between thumb and forefinger, holding it up to the gaslight with the intense concentration of a jeweler examining a rare gem. For a long moment he was silent, turning the stone over and over while his keen mind absorbed every detail. "Remarkable," he murmured at length. "I have examined thousands of geological specimens, Watson, yet I have never encountered anything quite like this. The surface suggests neither natural formation nor artificial manufacture. Most curious indeed." The threatening message. "There is one final detail, Mr. Holmes," Farquhar continued, his voice now barely audible. "This morning, before Penhaligon's body was even removed from the station, I received this." He produced a folded slip of paper from his waistcoat pocket. Holmes took it and read aloud. "Curiosity killed more than cats. Leave the shadows beneath St. Pancras alone, or you will join your friend. A well-wisher." The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of carriage wheels in the fog-shrouded street below. Holmes rose and began pacing with that restless energy I'd learned to associate with his most challenging cases. "Let us examine what we have established," he said, his voice taking on that crisp, analytical tone that indicated his mental machinery was fully engaged. "We have an ancient railway station built upon foundations that extend deep into London's subterranean layers. In these depths, a competent surveyor discovers architectural anomalies, doors that should not exist, sounds where there should be silence. Shortly thereafter, he meets his death in circumstances that appear accidental but bear several hallmarks of deliberate design. Finally, we have an anonymous correspondent who demonstrates intimate knowledge of recent events and issues explicit threats." He stopped pacing and fixed our visitor with his penetrating stare. "Mr. Farquhar, you mentioned in your final telegram that they will not believe you. To whom were you referring?" "To everyone, sir," Farquhar replied desperately. "The station master, the company directors, Inspector Lestrade, they all prefer the simple explanation of accidental death. They want this matter closed and forgotten as quickly as possible. But I knew Arthur Penhaligon for 15 years, Mr. Holmes. He was not a careless man. He would never have ventured so close to an unguarded shaft in darkness, and he certainly would never have set down his lamp and measuring chain with such precision if he were simply stumbling about in panic." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes bright with that peculiar gleam that indicated a problem worthy of his talents had presented itself. "You have done wisely to bring this matter to my attention, Mr. Farquhar. The official verdict of accidental death may satisfy the bureaucratic mind, but it fails to account for several highly significant details." He moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to peer into the fog-bound street. "Watson, I believe our evening's plans have undergone a dramatic revision. You have no pressing patients tomorrow." "None that cannot wait," I replied, already feeling that familiar mixture of apprehension and excitement that accompanied the beginning of one of Holmes's investigations. "Excellent. Then I suggest you don your heaviest boots and warmest coat. We are going to pay a visit to the shadows beneath St. Pancras Station." He turned back to Farquhar with a slight smile. "Sir, if you would be so kind as to serve as our guide, I should very much like to make the acquaintance of this impossible door and to examine the scene of Mr. Penhaligon's untimely demise. If there is indeed something lurking in the darkness below your station, we shall endeavor to bring it into the light." Thus it was that within the hour we found ourselves rattling through the fog-shrouded streets of London in a hansom cab, bound for the Gothic magnificence of St. Pancras Station, unaware, as no mortal man can be, of just how far into the hidden depths of the city and into the darker recesses of human nature this singular case would ultimately lead us. The cab deposited us before the magnificent Gothic facade of St. Pancras just as the station clock struck 10:30. Through the swirling fog, the great red brick structure loomed like some medieval cathedral, its soaring spires and pointed arches disappearing into the yellow murk above. The usual bustle of travellers had diminished to a mere trickle at this late hour, and the vast train shed echoed with an eerie emptiness that seemed to amplify every distant whistle and footfall. Farquhar led us not through the main entrance, but around to a side door marked "Railway Personnel Only." We descended a narrow spiral staircase that wound downward into increasing darkness, the gas lamps growing fewer and dimmer with each turn. The air grew noticeably colder and carried a peculiar smell, not merely coal dust and machine oil, but something else, something ancient and mineral that reminded me uncomfortably of crypts I had visited during my medical training. Holmes moved with his characteristic silent grace, his sharp eyes absorbing every architectural detail, every irregularity in the brickwork. Behind us, Farquhar's lantern cast grotesque shadows that danced across the vaulted ceiling like malevolent spirits. We passed through the coal storage vaults, vast chambers where mountains of black fuel stood ready to feed the hungry locomotives above, then into the maintenance tunnels, a warren of passages branching off like the burrows of some gigantic subterranean creature. "The maintenance shaft lies ahead," Farquhar whispered, though there seemed no reason for such caution. Perhaps the oppressive atmosphere of these depths affected him as it did me, creating an instinctive reluctance to disturb whatever silence held sway here. We emerged into a small chamber where a uniformed constable stood guard beside a square opening in the floor, protected by a temporary wooden rail. A dark stain on the flagstones nearby marked where the unfortunate surveyor had met his end. More significantly, Inspector Lestrade's spare, rat-like figure was bent over some object near the ground. "So you have come after all, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade remarked, straightening and dusting his hands. "I thought the railway people might persuade you to leave their little mishap alone." "Your thoughts, Inspector, though always of interest, are hardly prophetic," Holmes replied dryly. "You speak of a mishap. I perceive something rather more sinister." Holmes immediately dropped to his knees, withdrawing his magnifying lens. He crawled slowly around the shaft's perimeter, his nose mere inches from the ground, emitting little chirps of satisfaction. To the untrained eye, he was merely inspecting dirt, but I knew he was reading a narrative written in dust and debris. "You said Lestrade examined this area?" Holmes asked Farquhar without looking up. "Yes, sir. He spent considerable time here this morning." "And missed this entirely," Holmes chuckled, picking something invisible from a crack in the flagstones with his tweezers. He stood and held the object toward the lantern light, a tiny, jagged splinter of metal no larger than a grain of rice. "Brass, Watson. Soft, yellow brass. Observe, it is sheared off, not broken. Whatever caused this fragment to detach was moving with considerable velocity and struck the stone at an acute angle." He turned to Farquhar. "Did Mr. Penhaligon carry any brass instruments?" "Only his surveying telescope, but that was found intact." "Precisely. This fragment did not come from the victim. It came from a weapon. Someone struck at Penhaligon, missed and hit the floor. He recoiled, lost his footing, and fell. This was no accident, gentlemen. This was assault." Lestrade's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes, based on a mere speck of metal. Based on evidence you overlooked, Inspector. Now, Mr. Farquhar, show me this impossible door of yours. I suspect our answers lie behind it." We followed Farquhar deeper into the labyrinth, past iron columns painted dull red that stretched away into darkness like the pillars of some industrial cathedral. The air grew still, heavy with the weight of centuries. My hand instinctively sought the reassurance of my service revolver. Finally, we stood before the door that had so disturbed the late Arthur Penhaligon. A massive oak portal set flush into ancient brickwork, bearing no handle or visible lock, marked only by an iron plate depicting a cross enclosed within a circle. Holmes approached immediately, his lamp held close while his free hand traced the symbol with surprising gentleness. "Most interesting. Watson, observe the wood itself, remarkably well preserved for something supposedly sealed since 1867. No rot, no warping. Furthermore, note the absence of dust upon the iron plate, while the surrounding brickwork is thick with it." Suddenly, Holmes held up his hand, halting us mid-breath. "Listen," he hissed. From the darkness beyond came a sound that froze my blood, a slow, rhythmic scraping, like metal dragging against stone, growing steadily closer. For several heartbeats we stood motionless, our breath shallow, listening to that unmistakable cadence. The scraping ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving us in a silence so profound I could hear the rapid beating of my own heart. Farquhar's lantern trembled visibly in his grasp, casting wildly gyrating shadows over the ancient brickwork. Holmes alone appeared perfectly composed, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar excitement that dangerous problems never failed to rouse in him. "Remarkable acoustics in these tunnels," he murmured, pressing his ear against the oak surface. "The door's hollow, or rather, there is definitely a space beyond it. I can detect the faint movement of air, suggesting ventilation from some external source. More significantly, I smell paraffin oil, recently burned, and something else, a metallic chemical odor. Holmes began a methodical examination of the door itself, withdrawing his magnifying lens and scrutinizing every inch of the iron plate bearing the cross within a circle. Watson, observe the wood, remarkably well preserved for something supposedly sealed since 1867. No rot, no warping. Furthermore, note the absence of dust upon the iron plate, while the surrounding brickwork is thick with it. He knelt and examined the threshold with characteristic precision. The dust has been disturbed in a characteristic crescent pattern, more pronounced on the right, where one would push inward. This door has been opened, recently and frequently. His gloved finger traced a dark line along the lower panel. Lamp black and tallow, the residue of cheap candles, dragged repeatedly along the surface. Lestrade snorted with wounded pride. Even if that door does open, Mr. Holmes, what of it? A few trespassing vagrants could account for those signs easily enough. Could they indeed, Inspector? Holmes replied, producing his pocket knife. With deliberate precision, he inserted the blade into what appeared to be a hairline crack in the iron plate. There was an audible click, and the massive door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a chamber beyond that blazed with gaslight. We found ourselves staring into a vaulted brick cellar, clearly part of the original foundation, but extensively modified. Gas lines had been tapped from the main pipes to feed a series of bright, modern burners. Workbenches lined the walls, covered in molds, files, and precision tools that gleamed in the artificial light. The air was thick with the smell of heated metal and chemical vapors. "Good God," I breathed. "It's a workshop." Holmes strode into the chamber with evident satisfaction, his keen eyes absorbing every detail. He picked up an intricate wax mold from the nearest bench, examining it closely. Not merely a workshop, Watson, a manufactory, and a highly specialized one at that. He moved to the far wall where technical diagrams were pinned in orderly rows. These are schematics for the new hydraulic braking system the Midland Railway is testing. Someone has been manufacturing unauthorized copies. The implication struck me immediately. Corporate sabotage. Precisely. Inferior components made of cheaper alloys, intended to be substituted for the genuine articles. A single faulty brake cylinder could cause a catastrophic derailment. Holmes's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction, and Arthur Penhaligon, methodical surveyor that he was, stumbled upon this operation. He had to be silenced. Farquhar had followed us into the chamber, his face pale with shock. But who could have organized such a thing? The technical knowledge required, the access to company specifications. Someone with intimate knowledge of railway operations, Holmes replied, examining a series of metal ingots stacked near the furnace. Someone with access to the station's infrastructure and the authority to move freely through restricted areas. He picked up one of the bars, weighing it thoughtfully. High-grade nickel, refined and ready for casting. This represents a considerable investment. A sudden draft swept through the chamber, causing the gas flames to flicker ominously. Holmes spun toward the door, his head cocked at that familiar angle of intense concentration. "The air pressure has shifted," he whispered urgently. "Someone has opened an external access point, likely the service lift that connects to the platform level above." We strained our ears in the sudden silence. Then, echoing down the corridor from somewhere in the labyrinth beyond, came a sound that chilled my blood. The rhythmic, deliberate strike of a metal-tipped cane against stone, growing steadily louder. Tap, tap, tap. Holmes extinguished the nearest gas jet with swift efficiency. "Quickly, gentlemen, our mysterious benefactor approaches, and I suspect he does not intend a social call. Watson, your revolver at the ready. We are about to meet the architect of this enterprise, and I fear he has come to eliminate the remaining witnesses to his operation." The tapping grew closer, accompanied now by measured footsteps that spoke of supreme confidence and deadly purpose. The rhythmic tapping grew closer, each strike of metal against stone echoing through the vaulted chambers like a funeral march. Holmes gestured urgently toward the shadows behind the largest workbench, where we pressed ourselves into the darkness. My hand found the familiar grip of my service revolver, while Farquhar's labored breathing threatened to betray our position. Even Lestrade, for all his bluster, had the wisdom to remain perfectly still. The footsteps halted just beyond the threshold. A beam of light from a dark lantern swept across the workshop floor, pausing momentarily on the disturbed dust where Holmes had examined the brass fragment. The light moved methodically, professionally, suggesting someone intimately familiar with the chamber's layout. "I know you are here," came a cultured voice, refined and utterly without warmth. "The extinguished gas jet, the displaced tools. Your presence is as obvious as ink upon parchment to one who knows what to observe." Holmes stepped calmly into the light, his hands visible and empty. "Then you have the advantage of me, sir. You clearly know my methods, yet I have not had the pleasure of your acquaintance." The figure that emerged from the corridor was not the brutish criminal I had anticipated, but a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, impeccably dressed despite the subterranean setting. His silver hair was swept back from an intelligent forehead, and he leaned upon an ebony walking stick topped with what appeared to be a silver wolf's head. Most striking were his pale blue eyes, which surveyed us with the calculating precision of a chess master. "Dr. Heinrich Vogel," he replied with a slight bow. "Chief Consulting Engineer to the Midland Railway Company. I have supervised every significant modification to this station's infrastructure for the past 7 years, including the sealing of this chamber in 1873. "And its subsequent reopening," Holmes observed dryly, "along with the installation of gas lighting and a rather sophisticated metalworking operation. Your technical expertise is evident, Dr. Vogel, though I fear your ethics have not kept pace." Vogel's thin lips curved in something approximating a smile. "Ethics are a luxury afforded to those who have never known true want, Mr. Holmes. I came to England with nothing but my education and ambition. While directors grow fat on dividends, my innovations earn me a tradesman's wage." "So you supplemented your income through industrial sabotage," Holmes said, his voice carrying that dangerous edge I had learned to recognize. "Manufacturing inferior brake components to sell to competing railways, components designed to fail catastrophically." "You oversimplify," Vogel replied, though his expression confirmed Holmes's deduction. "When the Midland Railway's braking system fails spectacularly on a rival's locomotive, my employer will dominate the market while I collect substantial fees from those desperate to avoid similar disasters." Lestrade could contain himself no longer. "You murdered Arthur Penhaligon." Vogel's pale eyes flickered with mild interest. The man was remarkably persistent in his investigation. When he discovered this chamber 3 nights ago, I had no choice but to ensure his silence. I followed him to the maintenance shaft, struck at him with my walking stick, and gravity completed what I had begun. "Except for Mr. Farquhar," Holmes interjected, "whose loyalty prompted him to seek my assistance," which he foolishly ignored. Vogel's hand moved with surprising speed, withdrawing a compact revolver from his coat. "I regret that multiple deaths will be difficult to explain, but the alternative is unacceptable." The weapon's barrel swept across us with professional efficiency. I tensed, preparing to act, but Holmes raised a cautionary hand. "Before committing to such drastic action, Dr. Vogel, you might consider your associates." Vogel raised his cane and tapped it sharply against the floor. From the shadows emerged 3 burly figures in workmen's clothes, wielding heavy tools as weapons. These were the shadows that had haunted the tunnels. "Kill them," Vogel commanded simply. The men surged forward. I fired a warning shot that brought down ceiling dust but failed to deter them. Holmes snatched a heavy brass instrument from the nearest bench, hurling it with deadly accuracy at the lead attacker's forehead. "Watson, the gas line!" Holmes shouted, diving aside as a wrench crashed where he had stood. Understanding immediately, I aimed at the main gas pipe and fired. It ruptured with a violent hiss, filling the chamber with invisible, flammable vapor. "To the door," Holmes commanded, seizing the paralyzed Farquhar. As we scrambled into the corridor, Holmes grabbed a lantern and hurled it back into the gas-filled workshop. We threw ourselves flat as a tremendous explosion shook the station's foundations, tongues of flame roaring from the doorway. In the aftermath's confusion, through smoke and falling debris, I glimpsed Vogel's figure disappearing into a service passage that led upward toward the platforms. "He knows every passage in this labyrinth," Holmes muttered grimly. "We must intercept him before he reaches the street." The hunt had begun in earnest. The explosion's reverberations rolled through the tunnels like distant thunder, dislodging centuries of accumulated dust and plunging the corridor into a choking haze. Behind us, the secret workshop roared with hungry flames, consuming Vogel's carefully constructed operation in a matter of minutes. I could hear the tortured shriek of metal collapsing and the ominous groaning of stressed masonry, but Holmes wasted no time contemplating the destruction we had wrought. "This way, Watson," he commanded, seizing Farquhar by the arm and propelling him forward. "Lestrade, stay close. If Vogel reaches the main concourse before the alarm is raised, he will vanish into the night like smoke." We plunged deeper into the labyrinth, following a passage barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. The brick walls wept with condensation, and the air grew marginally clearer as we distanced ourselves from the conflagration. Far ahead, echoing faintly through the twisting corridors, we could still detect the rhythmic tap of Vogel's walking stick against stone. "He moves with confidence," I observed, my breath coming in sharp gasps. "No hesitation, no wrong turns." "Precisely what I expected," Holmes replied without slackening his pace. "A man who has operated in these depths for months will know every passage, every shortcut. But observe, Watson, he is not running. That measured tapping suggests a man proceeding according to a predetermined plan, not fleeing in panic." We burst into a wider corridor where narrow-gauge rails ran along the center, remnants of the old luggage transport system. Here, Holmes dropped suddenly to one knee, his magnifying lens appearing with characteristic swiftness. In the thin layer of grime beside the tracks lay clear impressions, the distinctive pattern of expensive continental leather and the circular mark of a cane's ferrule. "Excellent," Holmes murmured, rising with evident satisfaction. "The left footprint shows deeper impression along the outer edge. He favors that leg, likely injured by debris from the explosion. More significantly, observe the stride length. It has decreased markedly from his earlier tracks. Our quarry tires, gentlemen." The trail led us through a series of connecting chambers until we reached a circular brick shaft, perhaps 8 feet in diameter. An iron service ladder was bolted to the wall, ascending into darkness where a faint square of grey light marked the opening to street level. Fresh scuff marks on the rungs told their own story. "The hotel service exit," Holmes announced. "Ingenious. While we might expect him to attempt the main platforms, he chooses the route that emerges directly into the kitchen yards of the St. Pancras Hotel. From there, the Euston Road and anonymity." Without hesitation, Holmes began climbing with remarkable agility, his lean frame moving with practiced ease. I followed immediately, the familiar weight of my service revolver, a comforting presence. Below us, Lestrade and Farquhar struggled upward, their labored breathing echoing in the confined space. The shaft seemed to stretch endlessly, each rung a small victory, against gravity and exhaustion. My arms burned with effort, but Holmes's steady progress above spurred me onward. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed down the shaft as Holmes forced open the iron grating that sealed the opening. We emerged into a narrow alley behind the great hotel, where fog swirled thick as wool and the distant sounds of London traffic seemed muffled and dreamlike. The cold air struck my face like a benediction after the oppressive atmosphere below. Holmes stood perfectly still, his head tilted in that characteristic attitude of intense concentration. Through the fog came the irregular tap of Vogel's walking stick, moving steadily away from us toward the broader thoroughfare. "Quickly now," Holmes whispered, setting off with silent speed. He believes the explosion has bought him precious minutes. In truth, we have chosen the shorter route through the station's bowels, while he was forced to navigate the longer service passages. We moved like ghosts through the fog-shrouded alley, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the thick vapor. As we approached the mouth of the passage, Holmes raised his hand in warning. Ahead, barely visible through the murk, stood a hansom cab with its door open, the driver's silhouette hunched upon his box. Vogel's figure materialized from the fog, moving with that same measured pace despite his evident injury. He paused at the cab's door, his silver hair catching the wan light of a nearby gas lamp. For a moment, he stood motionless, as if sensing pursuit, his pale eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness behind him. "Now, Watson," Holmes breathed, his hand moving to his coat pocket. "The final act begins." Before Holmes could signal our advance, he raised his hand in warning, his keen eyes fixed upon the scene before us. Through the swirling fog, I could observe what had arrested his attention. The cab driver sat with unnatural rigidity upon his box, and the horse's brass fittings caught the gaslight in a manner that seemed oddly familiar. "Watson," Holmes whispered with barely contained excitement, "observe the harness decorations. Note the distinctive crest upon the blinkers, not the simple mark of a livery stable, but something far more significant." I strained my vision through the murk and felt my pulse quicken as recognition dawned. The Metropolitan Police insignia. But how? It appears Inspector Lestrade possessed more foresight than we credited him with, Holmes murmured with evident satisfaction. While we pursued our quarry through the tunnels, he must have coordinated with the street patrol to secure the most likely escape routes. That is no hired cab driver, but a constable in disguise. Even as Holmes spoke, Vogel approached the vehicle with his characteristic measured gait, seemingly unaware of the trap that awaited him. His silver head gleamed in the lamplight as he reached for the cab door, his wounded leg causing him to lean heavily upon his walking stick. "Your journey ends here, Dr. Vogel," Holmes called out, stepping into the circle of gaslight with theatrical precision. "I would strongly advise against any precipitous action." Vogel froze, his hand still gripping the door handle, then turned with the deliberate calm of a man who had anticipated this moment. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. Gone was any pretense of the cultured engineer, replaced by the cold calculation of a cornered predator, assessing his final options. "Mr. Holmes," he said with admirable composure, though I noted his knuckles had whitened around the silver wolf's head of his cane. "Your persistence is indeed legendary, but I fear you have underestimated the complexity of this particular game." The disguised constable upon the driver's box shifted almost imperceptibly, his hand moving toward what I suspected was a concealed truncheon. Meanwhile, Lestrade and Farquhar emerged from the alley behind us, followed by two additional officers who materialized from the fog with professional stealth. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction I knew so well. "I calculated from the moment we discovered your workshop that a man of your resources would have arranged multiple contingencies. This cab, waiting at precisely this location despite the fog and late hour, spoke of careful planning. However, you made one critical error." Vogel's pale eyes narrowed. "Indeed? Enlighten me." Holmes gestured toward the vehicle with elegant precision. "You assumed the cab awaiting you would be the one you had arranged. Your actual driver is currently enjoying the hospitality of Scotland Yard, while Constable Bradstreet here has been maintaining this vigil for the better part of an hour." Understanding flashed across Vogel's features, followed immediately by desperate resolve. Rather than surrender, he suddenly lunged forward, his cane sweeping in a vicious arc toward the nearest constable. The silver wolf's head connected with the man's temple with a sickening crack, sending him sprawling upon the wet cobblestones. "Take him!" Lestrade shouted, but Vogel was already in motion, his injured leg forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. He produced the compact revolver we had seen earlier, leveling it at Holmes with practiced efficiency. Before he could fire, however, my own weapon was in my hand. The report echoed sharply through the fog-bound alley, and Vogel's pistol went spinning across the stones as my bullet struck his wrist. He staggered, clutching the wounded appendage, but his expression remained defiant, even as the remaining constables swarmed him. "Enough, Dr. Vogel," Holmes said quietly, approaching the fallen man as the officers secured his wrists in iron shackles. "Your game is played out." Vogel ceased struggling, his chest heaving as he stared up at us with cold fury. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, mingling with the soot and grime of the tunnels, yet his bearing retained its eerie composure. "You think this is victory, Mr. Holmes?" he sneered, attempting to wipe his face against his shoulder. "You have stopped nothing. The designs are already distributed. My associates possess copies of every crucial specification." Holmes retrieved Vogel's distinctive cane from where it had fallen, examining the silver wolf's head handle with intense scrutiny. "An impressive piece of craftsmanship," he observed conversationally. "German workmanship, I should say, with rather ingenious modifications." With sudden understanding, I watched as Holmes twisted the ornamental head sharply to the left. A soft click echoed in the silence, and the wolf's head unscrewed completely, revealing a hollow cavity within the shaft. From this hiding place, Holmes withdrew a tightly rolled sheaf of papers bound with red ribbon. "However," Holmes continued, unrolling the documents with evident satisfaction, "I suspect your associates will find their copies significantly less useful without these, the final calibration tables for the hydraulic pressure systems. Without these specific calculations, any attempt to manufacture your sabotaged components will result in immediate failure during testing, rather than the delayed catastrophe you intended." For the first time since our confrontation began, Vogel's composure cracked entirely. His face twisted in a rictus of pure hatred and disbelief. "Impossible. How could you know?" "Elementary observation, combined with logical deduction," Holmes replied with characteristic precision. "When you threatened us in the workshop, you held this cane in your left hand while brandishing your revolver with your right. Yet your earlier footprints clearly indicated you favor your right leg. A man genuinely relying on a walking stick for support would naturally hold it opposite his injured side. You held it in your left hand to protect it, suggesting it contained something of greater value than mere physical support. Furthermore, the peculiar balance when you struck poor Penhaligon, as evidenced by the brass fragment we discovered, indicated a hollow upper section that would affect the weapon's center of gravity." Lestrade stepped forward with evident triumph, his chest swelling with official pride. "Heinrich Vogel, I arrest you for the willful murder of Arthur Penhaligon, attempted murder, industrial sabotage, and conspiracy against the Crown. It's the gallows for you, my man." As the constables prepared to escort their prisoner to the waiting police wagon, Vogel cast one final look in our direction, not the defeated glance of a captured criminal, but the calculating assessment of a chess master studying an opponent for future reference. "This is not concluded, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, his voice carrying an ominous certainty. "There are forces at work here that extend far beyond my humble workshop. You have won this engagement, but the war continues in shadows you have not yet imagined." The police wagon rattled away into the fog, bearing our prisoner toward justice, yet his final words lingered in the damp air like a malevolent prophecy. As we walked back toward the main thoroughfare to secure our own transport, I could not shake the feeling that we had solved only the visible portion of a far more complex and dangerous puzzle. "A most unsettling conclusion," I remarked to Holmes as we emerged onto the Euston Road. "Indeed, Watson," he replied thoughtfully, lighting his pipe against the cold night air. Dr. Vogel was undoubtedly brilliant, but brilliance without moral foundation becomes mere cunning in service of destruction. Yet his final words suggest this case may have deeper roots than we initially suspected. The great Gothic spires of St. Pancras Station rose behind us into the fog-shrouded darkness, their shadows seeming to harbor secrets yet undiscovered. Though we had brought one criminal to justice, I sensed that other mysteries still slumbered in the depths of London, waiting for the day they would emerge into the unforgiving light of truth. The grey light of dawn was filtering through our Baker Street windows when Holmes finally set aside his magnifying glass and leaned back in his chair with a gesture of profound dissatisfaction. The evidence from Vogel's workshop lay spread across our breakfast table: technical drawings, metal samples, and most prominently, that disturbing fragment of black stone that had been clutched in poor Penhaligon's dying grasp. "You appear troubled, Holmes," I observed, noting the familiar furrow between his brows that indicated his mind was wrestling with some particularly vexing problem. "Surely the case is resolved. Vogel is in custody, his sabotage operation destroyed, and the Midland Railway saved from potential catastrophe." Holmes rose and began that restless pacing which I had learned to associate with his deepest cogitations. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what troubles me. The affair is too neat, altogether too convenient in its resolution." "In what respect?" I inquired, setting down my coffee cup with genuine curiosity. "Consider Vogel's behavior during our confrontation," Holmes replied, pausing before the fireplace. "Here was a man of undeniable intelligence, caught in the act of industrial sabotage and facing the gallows. Yet at no point did he inquire how we had discovered his operation, nor who had first directed our attention to the tunnels beneath St. Pancras. A mind of his caliber would be consumed with identifying the weakness that led to his exposure." Holmes retrieved the black stone fragment, holding it toward the morning light, where its oily surface exhibited that same disturbing iridescence I had noted the previous evening. "Moreover, this object continues to perplex me. I have subjected it to every chemical test at my disposal, Watson. It is neither coal, shale, nor any mineral with which I am familiar. Under magnification, its surface reveals minute linear striations, not natural fissures, but marks suggesting artificial manipulation. The mystery of the door." "But surely the stone came from Vogel's workshop," I suggested. "Some byproduct of his metallurgical processes?" "That was my initial hypothesis," Holmes admitted, "yet it fails to account for several crucial observations. The door we discovered, that massive oak portal bearing the iron cross within a circle, was no part of Vogel's operation. He claimed to have supervised its sealing in 1873, yet the hinges were recently oiled, the wood showed no signs of age, and the iron plate had been polished within the past month." Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew a sheet of paper covered with his precise handwriting. "I've been analyzing the architectural inconsistencies, Watson. That door was designed to appear ancient while being entirely modern. Someone invested considerable effort in creating the illusion of historical authenticity. But why? Perhaps Vogel required a dramatic entrance to his workshop, I ventured, though even as I spoke, the explanation sounded insufficient. "Vogel was a man of ruthless practicality," Holmes replied with a shake of his head. "Every aspect of his operation, we observed, was governed by efficiency and concealment. He would never waste resources on theatrical flourishes. No, Watson, that door was created by someone else, for purposes we have yet to fathom." Disturbing discoveries. Our discussion was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock. She entered bearing not her usual silver tray, but a worn leather satchel that I recognized immediately as belonging to the late Arthur Penhaligon. "Inspector Lestrade sent this round, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He said you might find the contents illuminating, though he couldn't make heads or tails of them himself." Holmes accepted the satchel with evident interest, immediately emptying its contents upon our table. Among the surveying instruments and measurement notebooks lay a collection of sketches that made my blood run cold. Page after page depicted the mysterious door from various angles, accompanied by detailed measurements and notations in Penhaligon's precise hand. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, studying the drawings intently. Penhaligon was far more thorough in his investigation than we realized. "Look here, Watson. He has documented multiple visits to the door, spanning nearly 3 weeks. Each sketch shows progressive changes." I leaned closer to examine the drawings. The earliest depicted the door exactly as we had found it, but subsequent sketches showed subtle alterations. The iron plate appearing more tarnished, additional scratches around the frame, even what appeared to be fresh chisel marks in the surrounding brickwork. Someone was modifying the door's appearance over time, I realized with growing unease, making it appear more aged and weathered. Precisely. And observe this final sketch, dated the very day of Penhaligon's death. Holmes indicated a drawing that showed the door slightly ajar, with darkness visible beyond. He had finally gained entry to whatever lay behind it. The larger conspiracy. Holmes moved to the window, gazing down at the bustling street with that distant expression I had learned to associate with his most profound deductions. "Watson, I believe we have been witnessing only the surface of a far more complex operation. Vogel's sabotage workshop was real enough, but it served as camouflage for something else entirely." "What do you mean?" "Consider the evidence methodically. An ancient-appearing door concealing modern secrets. A surveyor murdered for investigating too thoroughly. A fragment of unknown material that defies conventional analysis. And, most significantly, Vogel's curious lack of concern about how his operation was discovered." Holmes turned from the window with sudden decision. "I believe Vogel expected to be caught, Watson. His entire operation may have been designed to draw attention away from the true purpose of that chamber, to make us believe we had solved the mystery when we had merely scratched its surface." Before I could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs announced an urgent visitor. A moment later, a young constable burst through our door, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "Inspector Lestrade sends his compliments and begs you to come at once. There's been another incident at St. Pancras Station. They've found something in the tunnel, sir. Something that shouldn't be there." Holmes was already reaching for his coat, his eyes bright with that familiar gleam of intellectual challenge. "Another body?" he inquired sharply. "No, sir, not a body. A room, sir, hidden behind that door you found yesterday. And Mr. Holmes—" The constable swallowed heavily. "The room isn't empty. There's someone down there. Someone who claims he's been waiting for you." As we prepared to return to the shadowy depth beneath St. Pancras, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to discover the true heart of this mystery, and that our previous night's victory had been merely the opening move in a far more dangerous game. The morning fog swirled around us as we stepped into the street, but I sensed that the real darkness lay waiting in the tunnels below, where ancient secrets and modern conspiracies had become inextricably intertwined. The acrid smell of smoke and burned chemicals still permeated the tunnels as we descended once more into the depth beneath St. Pancras Station. The explosion had left its mark throughout the subterranean passages. Soot-blackened walls, emergency timber supports, and the persistent tang of destruction that spoke eloquently of the previous night's violence. Yet there was something else in the air now, something that had not been present during our earlier investigation, a sense of expectancy, as if the very stones were holding their breath. Inspector Lestrade awaited us at the entrance to what remained of Vogel's workshop, his normally sharp features drawn with fatigue and something approaching genuine unease. Behind him stood 2 constables whose pale faces suggested they had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of proper police work. "Thank heaven you've arrived, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, dispensing with his usual professional reserve. The fire crews made a discovery while clearing debris from the blast. Behind the workshop's rear wall, a false construction as it turns out, they found another chamber, and in that chamber— He paused, swallowing heavily. Well, you'd best see for yourself, sir. We followed him past the charred remnants of Vogel's metallurgical operation, where twisted machinery and collapsed workbenches created a landscape of industrial devastation. At the chamber's far end, where stacked crates had previously concealed the wall, a jagged opening revealed the explosion's most significant consequence, the exposure of a carefully constructed deception. Holmes immediately knelt to examine the debris, his magnifying lens appearing with characteristic swiftness. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, indicating the scattered brickwork. This was not a supporting wall, but an elaborate facade. Note the mortar, barely 6 months old, despite being designed to appear ancient. Someone invested considerable effort in concealing what lay beyond. The hidden archive. The opening led to a chamber that defied every expectation our investigation had established. Unlike the utilitarian workshop, this space possessed the atmosphere of a scholar's private study. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with books, but with carefully catalogued specimens, geological samples, ancient artifacts, and glass vessels containing materials that seemed to shift and gleam in the lamplight, with their own inner luminescence. At the chamber's center sat a figure who rose with deliberate composure as we entered. A gentleman of perhaps 60 years, distinguished by silver hair and intelligent gray eyes that regarded us with neither surprise nor alarm. His dress was that of an academic, impeccably maintained despite the subterranean setting, and his bearing suggested a man accustomed to command. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said in a voice of remarkable calm. "I am Professor Edmund Blackwood, formerly of the Royal Society. I have been expecting you, though I confess your arrival is somewhat earlier than my calculations predicted." Holmes studied the man with that penetrating gaze that had reduced countless criminals to stammering confession. "You claim to have expected me, Professor Blackwood. Yet you sit calmly reading while a man lies dead and another faces the gallows. I find your composure somewhat remarkable under the circumstances." The scholar's confession. Blackwood gestured to the shelves surrounding us, each laden with specimens that seemed to whisper of ages beyond human memory. "Dr. Vogel's arrest was an unfortunate necessity, Mr. Holmes. His sabotage operation provided the perfect camouflage while I completed 30 years of research into matters that conventional science refuses to acknowledge." "What manner of research requires such elaborate concealment?" I demanded, my hand instinctively moving toward my revolver. The professor's eyes, remarkably sharp for a man of his apparent years, fixed upon me with unsettling intensity. "Dr. Watson, I presume, your military bearing is unmistakable. To answer your question, this chamber sits atop foundations far older than London itself. When the railway excavations began in the 1860s, the workmen uncovered materials that predated Roman occupation. The directors, fearing delays and public speculation, ordered everything sealed and forgotten. Holmes had begun examining the shelves with characteristic thoroughness, occasionally withdrawing an object for closer inspection. "The black stone fragment found in Penhaligon's hand," he said suddenly. "It originated here." "Indeed," Blackwood confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of profound discovery. "A sample from deposits that extend deep beneath this site. The stone possesses properties that challenge our understanding of geology, chemistry, even physics itself. I have devoted my career to studying such anomalies, materials that suggest our planet harbors secrets far stranger than conventional wisdom admits." The moral complexity Lestrade, who had listened with growing impatience, finally interjected. "Very fascinating, I'm sure, Professor. But what of Arthur Penhaligon? What of his death?" For the first time, Blackwood's composed demeanor cracked slightly. "Poor Penhaligon discovered me here 3 weeks ago during his routine survey work. I attempted to explain the significance of my research, to make him understand why such knowledge must be carefully guarded. But he insisted on reporting his findings to the railway authorities." "So Vogel eliminated him at your instruction?" Lestrade said with barely contained fury. "Not at my instruction," Blackwood replied firmly, though his eyes betrayed genuine regret. "Vogel acted independently, seeing Penhaligon as a threat to his own criminal enterprise. I confess, however, that I did nothing to prevent it, a moral failure that will haunt me regardless of any earthly judgment." Holmes moved to a shadowed alcove where additional specimens gleamed with that same disturbing iridescence we had observed in the stone fragment. "Professor Blackwood, I've encountered many individuals who justified questionable actions through appeals to higher purpose. What makes your case different?" The scholar's face grew grave as he approached a covered object at the chamber's center. "Because, Mr. Holmes, my research has revealed that this site, this specific location, was chosen by our predecessors, not for its convenience, but for its proximity to something that has slumbered beneath London for millennia. And my calculations suggest that slumber is ending." He drew back the cloth covering, revealing a complex arrangement of instruments surrounding a larger specimen of the black stone, this one pulsing with a faint, rhythmic luminescence that seemed almost organic in its regularity. "In approximately 72 hours, Blackwood continued quietly, "this material will reach a state of activity not seen since the Roman legions first encountered it. And if we are not properly prepared to contain what emerges, Dr. Vogel's sabotage will seem trivial by comparison." The chamber fell silent save for the distant rumble of trains above and an almost inaudible humming that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. Holmes stood motionless, his brilliant mind undoubtedly racing through countless deductions and calculations, while the implications of Blackwood's revelation settled over us like a shroud. Finally, Holmes turned to face us all, his expression more grave than I had seen since our encounter with Professor Moriarty. "Professor Blackwood, I suggest you explain yourself with considerably more precision and considerably less mysticism. What exactly are you preparing for, and why should I not have Inspector Lestrade place you under immediate arrest as an accessory to murder?" As if in response to his words, the humming from the stone grew perceptibly stronger, and somewhere in the ancient darkness beyond the chamber, something that had waited centuries began to stir. The humming from the central stone grew steadily more pronounced, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate through the very foundations of the station above us. Professor Blackwood moved with practiced efficiency among his instruments, adjusting dials and recording measurements with the methodical precision of a man who had devoted years to understanding forces that conventional science refused to acknowledge. "You demand material explanation, Mr. Holmes," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the weight of profound conviction. "Very well. What you see before you is not merely stone, but a form of crystalline conductor, a geological anomaly that exhibits properties similar to what Professor Curie has recently termed piezoelectric behavior, yet far more complex in its manifestations." Holmes stepped closer to the apparatus, his keen eyes absorbing every detail of the professor's elaborate measuring devices. "Piezoelectric effects involve the conversion of mechanical stress into electrical current. You suggest this material operates on similar principles?" "The scientific foundation." "Precisely, but on a scale that dwarfs anything previously documented," Blackwood replied, indicating a series of copper wires that snaked across the floor in intricate patterns. "For decades, this deposit has been subjected to constant mechanical vibration, the weight of locomotives, the percussion of steam hammers, the rhythmic operation of the great engines above. Each impact, each tremor, contributes to an accumulating electrical charge within the crystalline matrix." He moved to a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous calculations and gestured toward columns of figures that stretched across multiple pages. "I have documented the progression with mathematical precision. The rate of accumulation follows a logarithmic curve, accelerating as the stored energy approaches a critical threshold. When that threshold is exceeded, the material will discharge its accumulated power in a catastrophic release." Holmes examined the journal with characteristic intensity, his trained mind quickly grasping the implications of the professor's work. And you believe we are approaching this threshold imminently? Within 72 hours, perhaps less, Blackwood confirmed grimly. The explosion in Vogel's workshop removed the most significant source of mechanical disturbance, which has bought us precious time. However, the system remains perilously unstable. Consider the consequences, Mr. Holmes. A massive electrical discharge through the iron framework of the station, the gas mains, the signal systems. The resulting failures could cause simultaneous derailments, explosions, and structural collapse. The historical context, Lestrade, who had been listening with growing impatience, finally interjected, "This is all very fascinating, Professor, but it sounds like elaborate fiction to me. Ancient stones with magical properties? I'll have none of it." "There is nothing magical about electromagnetic phenomena, Inspector," Blackwood replied with academic composure. During the original excavations for St. Pancras in the 1860s, the chief engineer, William Henry Barlow, discovered a series of chambers carved into the living rock beneath this site. These chambers contained deposits of this unusual material, along with evidence of sophisticated understanding of its properties. Holmes looked up sharply from the journal. "Evidence? What manner of evidence?" "Copper conductors, arranged in precise geometric patterns, stone channels designed to direct the flow of water, natural cooling systems to prevent overheating during discharge events." The ancient builders understood intuitively what we are only beginning to comprehend through modern science, that this site requires careful management to prevent catastrophic energy release. Blackwood moved to a cabinet and withdrew a series of architectural drawings, spreading them across a cleared workbench. "These are my reconstructions of the original chamber layouts, based on what Barlow discovered before the railway directors ordered everything sealed and forgotten. The builders created a containment system designed to channel periodic discharges safely into the surrounding earth." Holmes's dilemma. Holmes studied the drawings with intense concentration, his analytical mind wrestling with evidence that challenged conventional understanding while remaining grounded in observable phenomena. I could see the familiar signs of his mental processes, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the unconscious tapping of his fingers against his thigh, that indicated he was constructing a logical framework to encompass these extraordinary claims. "Professor Blackwood," he said finally, "your scientific methodology appears sound, your documentation meticulous. Yet you have admitted to tolerating murder and conducting unauthorized research. How am I to reconcile your apparent dedication to preventing catastrophe with your moral compromises?" For the first time since our encounter began, Blackwood's composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine emotion. "I've spent 30 years studying phenomena that the Royal Society would dismiss as impossible. When Vogel approached me with his proposal, access to these chambers in exchange for concealing his criminal enterprise, I saw an opportunity to continue work that could save thousands of lives. I convinced myself that tolerating his petty crimes was justified by the greater good I sought to achieve. Yet Arthur Penhaligon died because of that decision," I observed, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. "A tragedy that haunts me, Dr. Watson. Penhaligon was a good man, methodical and honest. When he discovered my work 3 weeks ago, I attempted to explain the significance of what lay beneath the station. He listened with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions, even offered to help document the site properly. But when I revealed the necessity of maintaining secrecy, he insisted on reporting his findings to the railway authorities. The immediate threat, the humming from the central stone, suddenly intensified, causing the delicate instruments to vibrate visibly on their stands. Blackwood moved quickly to his control panel, adjusting several dials with practiced efficiency. "The discharge rate is accelerating," he announced, his voice tight with concern. "We have less time than I calculated. The explosion in Vogel's workshop created stress fractures in the surrounding rock that are allowing accumulated energy to leak into adjacent systems." Holmes moved to the pulsing stone, observing its increasingly rapid luminescence with scientific fascination tempered by growing alarm. What precisely do you propose to do about this situation, Professor? I've spent months preparing a controlled discharge system, Blackwood replied, indicating the network of copper conductors that crisscross the chamber floor. These grounding rods extend deep into the water table beneath the station. When properly calibrated, they can channel the energy released safely into the earth, dissipating it harmlessly over a wide area rather than allowing it to concentrate in the station's infrastructure. But such a system would require precise timing and coordination, Holmes observed. Any miscalculation could prove catastrophic. Precisely why I cannot be removed from this chamber until the crisis has passed, Blackwood said with quiet determination. I'm the only person alive who understands the calibration requirements. Arrest me afterward by all means, but allow me to complete this work first. The weight of decision. Holmes stood in contemplative silence, weighing the extraordinary claims against the potential consequences of inaction. The pulsing stone cast shifting shadows across his angular features, and I could see the internal struggle between his rational skepticism and the mounting evidence that something far beyond ordinary criminal activity was unfolding in the depths beneath London. "Inspector Lestrade," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of absolute decision, "I propose a compromise. Professor Blackwood will remain here under guard to complete his containment procedures. You will station constables at every entrance to ensure he cannot escape, but no one will interfere with his work until this alleged crisis has passed. If nothing occurs within the time frame he has specified, you may arrest him with my full cooperation." Lestrade looked from Holmes to the increasingly active stone, his policeman's instincts warring with the evidence of his own senses. "And if he's lying, if this is all an elaborate deception, then we will have lost nothing but time," Holmes replied. "But if he speaks the truth, Inspector, the cost of disbelief could be measured in hundreds of lives. Under the circumstances, I believe the risk of inaction outweighs the risk of misplaced trust." As if in response to his words, the ancient stone pulsed with renewed intensity, its luminescence now bright enough to cast distinct shadows throughout the chamber. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, that inexplicable humming grew deeper and more insistent, like the breathing of some vast entity stirring from centuries of slumber. The next 72 hours would determine whether Professor Blackwood was London's salvation or its most dangerous deceiver, and whether the rational world of Sherlock Holmes could accommodate truths that science had yet to explain. The tension in Blackwood's chamber had become nearly unbearable as the afternoon wore on. The humming from the central stone now resonated through the very foundations of the station, causing fine cracks to appear in the ancient masonry and setting every metal object vibrating with sympathetic frequency. Holmes had dispatched urgent messages to the station master, orchestrating the evacuation of platforms under the pretext of emergency gas line repairs, a deception that avoided panic while clearing the area of innocent bystanders. "The discharge rate has accelerated beyond my calculations," Blackwood announced, his hands moving with practiced efficiency across the control panel. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the chamber's chill. The explosion in Vogel's workshop created stress fractures that are allowing accumulated energy to leak into adjacent systems. We have perhaps 30 minutes before the threshold is reached. Holmes positioned himself beside the secondary control station, his keen eyes monitoring the delicate instruments with scientific precision. "Professor, I observe that your grounding conductors are beginning to glow. Is this within acceptable parameters?" "Barely," Blackwood replied tersely. "Watson, I require you at the cooling valve, that brass wheel near the rear wall. When I give the signal, open it completely. Lestrade, monitor the tunnel entrance. If this containment fails, the resulting discharge could destabilize the entire station structure." The stone's pulsing intensified dramatically, its luminescence now bright enough to read by. The air crackled with static electricity, raising the hairs on our arms and creating a metallic taste that made breathing difficult. Through the vaulted ceiling above, we could hear the distant rumble of the last trains departing the evacuated platforms. "Critical threshold approaching," Holmes announced, his voice cutting through the growing din. The needle on the primary galvanometer climbed steadily toward the red danger zone. 90%. 95. Suddenly, the chamber shuddered violently. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and several glass vessels shattered on their shelves. The central stone blazed with blinding white light, illuminating every corner of the ancient space with supernatural brilliance. "Now!" Blackwood shouted, throwing the main switch with decisive force. I spun the cooling valve with all my strength as Holmes activated the secondary grounding system. The copper conductors throughout the chamber flared to incandescent life, carrying massive electrical current deep into the earth below. The air filled with the sharp smell of ozone and superheated metal. For several heartbeats, the world dissolved into pure energy. Light beyond description flooded the chamber, not merely white, but containing spectrums that belonged to no earthly rainbow. The subsonic vibration reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very atoms of our beings, then suddenly ceased. The blinding radiance faded to a dull glow, then to darkness as the stone's mysterious luminescence extinguished entirely. The copper rods cooled rapidly from white heat to cherry red to their normal appearance. Steam vented harmlessly through the upper shafts, carrying away the excess thermal energy. Blackwood slumped against his control panel, exhausted but triumphant. "It is accomplished," he whispered. "The energy has been safely dissipated into the water table. London is secure." Holmes approached the now dormant stone, examining it with scientific fascination. Under his touch, the surface appeared cold and lifeless, no longer the strange pulsing entity it had been moments before. Remarkable. Whatever properties this material possessed, the discharge has rendered it completely inert. "For our lifetimes, at least," Blackwood confirmed. "The next accumulation cycle will require decades, perhaps centuries, but the containment system is now calibrated and proven effective." Lestrade stepped forward, his official duties reasserting themselves, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Professor Edmund Blackwood, I place you under arrest for concealing criminal activity and as accessory to murder. However," he added with unusual consideration, "I shall testify that your cooperation prevented a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions." Blackwood offered no resistance as the handcuffs were applied. "I accept full responsibility for my moral failures, Inspector. I ask only that my research be preserved and this site properly monitored. The ancient builders understood what we have only begun to comprehend." As we ascended from the depths for the final time, Holmes remained thoughtfully silent. Only when we reached the familiar comfort of Baker Street did he speak. "Watson, we have witnessed phenomena that challenge the very foundations of conventional science. Yet rather than diminishing the power of rational inquiry, this case demonstrates its ultimate triumph. What appeared supernatural proved amenable to scientific analysis and practical solution." "And the broader implications?" I asked, settling into my accustomed chair. Holmes smiled faintly, reaching for his violin. "That the universe contains wonders yet undiscovered, my dear fellow. Our task is not to deny such mysteries, but to expand our understanding until they yield to reason. The shadow beneath St. Pancras has been illuminated, but how many others remain hidden in London's depths?" The melancholic strains of a Bach partita filled our sitting room, a fitting counterpoint to the extraordinary forces we had confronted in the ancient darkness below. The weeks following our extraordinary encounter beneath St. Pancras brought a succession of developments that Holmes followed with characteristic attention to detail, though I observed that his satisfaction with the case's resolution remained incomplete. The morning papers carried detailed accounts of Dr. Heinrich Vogel's trial, where the evidence of industrial sabotage and premeditated murder proved overwhelming. The German engineer maintained his composure throughout the proceedings, offering no defense save a curious insistence that greater minds than his own had orchestrated the affair. Such claims were dismissed by the court as the desperate fabrications of a condemned man, and Vogel met his fate at Newgate with the same methodical precision he had once applied to his criminal enterprises. Professor Edmund Blackwood's case proved more complex, reflecting the moral ambiguities that had characterized our entire investigation. His cooperation in preventing the catastrophic discharge, combined with testimony from several Royal Society members regarding his previous contributions to geological science, earned him a measure of judicial mercy. Rather than the gallows, he received a sentence of confinement in a private institution where his unique knowledge of the St. Pancras site could be preserved should future circumstances require it. The authorities, I learned through Holmes's government connections, had quietly established a small monitoring station in the sealed chambers, staffed by men sworn to absolute discretion. A pragmatic solution, Holmes remarked one grey December morning as we reviewed the official reports. Blackwood's genius was real, even if his judgment proved fatally flawed. The Crown understands that his expertise regarding such phenomena may prove invaluable should similar situations arise elsewhere in London's foundations. The surveyor's final testament, our contemplation of these matters, was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Arthur Penhaligon, dressed in the deep mourning that befitted her recent loss. Holmes received her with uncharacteristic gentleness, offering his chair and expressing condolences that carried genuine warmth rather than mere social obligation. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady despite the evident strain of grief, "I've discovered something among my husband's effects that I believe you should examine." Arthur was meticulous in his record-keeping, and his final weeks were documented with unusual thoroughness. She produced a leather portfolio containing detailed sketches and measurements of the mysterious door, along with observations that demonstrated Penhaligon's growing unease about what lay beneath the station. Most significantly, the portfolio included correspondence with other railway surveyors across Britain, men who had encountered similar architectural anomalies during excavation projects in Manchester, Edinburgh, and Bristol. "Your husband was conducting a broader investigation," Holmes observed, studying the letters with intense concentration. He suspected that the St. Pancras site was not unique. He became convinced that certain locations throughout Britain contained what he termed geological irregularities that required careful monitoring. Mrs. Penhaligon confirmed. Arthur believed he had stumbled upon something of national importance, something that transcended mere railway construction. After she departed, Holmes spread Penhaligon's materials across our table, his keen eyes absorbing every detail. "Watson, observe the pattern emerging from these reports. Each site shares certain characteristics: proximity to ancient settlements, unusual mineral deposits, and most significantly, a history of periodic accidents that required extensive repairs or modifications to contain. You believe there are other locations like the chamber beneath St. Pancras? I believe, my dear fellow, that we have uncovered evidence of a phenomenon far more widespread than we initially suspected. Penhaligon's correspondence suggests that someone, or some organization, has been quietly monitoring these sites for decades, perhaps centuries." The larger pattern. Holmes rose and began that familiar pacing which indicated his mental machinery operating at full capacity. Consider the curious coincidence of Vogel establishing his operation in precisely the chamber that concealed Blackwood's research. Was this mere chance, or was Vogel deliberately positioned to serve as both camouflage and potential scapegoat? You suspect he was manipulated? I suspect, Watson, that we have solved only the visible portion of a far more complex puzzle. Vogel's financial backing came from sources that remain frustratingly obscure. Continental investors channeling funds through banks that specialize in maintaining anonymity. The question becomes, what did these mysterious benefactors hope to achieve? Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street where gas lamps created pools of yellow light in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in London, perhaps in chambers similar to those beneath St. Pancras, there are individuals who understand the true nature of what we confronted. They funded Vogel's operation not for mere profit, but to gain access to knowledge that conventional science has yet to acknowledge. The enduring mystery. As the weeks passed and winter settled over London, Holmes continued his analysis of the materials we had gathered, occasionally disappearing for entire days on mysterious errands that he declined to explain. I observed that his usual satisfaction with a case's resolution remained notably absent, replaced by the restless energy that characterized his encounters with problems that defied complete solution. One evening, as we sat before the fire with our customary brandy and cigars, I ventured to ask what continued to trouble him about the affair. "What troubles me, Watson, is the recognition that we have illuminated one shadow only to discover that it was cast by something far larger and more complex than we initially perceived. The stone beneath St. Pancras has been rendered inert. Blackwood's discharge system has proven effective, and the immediate threat to London has been neutralized. Yet the fundamental questions remain unanswered." He leaned forward, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight with unusual intensity. "Who were Blackwood's true masters? What is the ultimate purpose of monitoring these ancient sites? And most significantly, how many other locations throughout Britain harbor similar secrets?" Holmes reached for his pipe, filling it with the methodical care that always preceded his deepest contemplations. "This case has taught me that London, indeed all of Britain, rests upon foundations far older and stranger than our history's record. We have prevented one catastrophe, but I suspect there are other forces stirring in the darkness, other mysteries waiting to emerge into the light." The fire crackled peacefully in the grate, and the familiar sounds of Baker Street filtered through our windows. Yet I could not shake the feeling that our investigation had opened a door that could never be fully closed, that we had glimpsed the edge of a vast tapestry of secrets woven into the very fabric of our nation's history. "The game, as you so often remind me, is afoot," I observed. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied with a slight smile that carried both satisfaction and anticipation. "And I suspect that the shadow beneath St. Pancras was merely the first move in a contest whose true dimensions we have yet to comprehend. But that, my dear fellow, is precisely what makes our profession endlessly fascinating." The fog swirled outside our windows, thick and impenetrable, concealing secrets that even Sherlock Holmes had only begun to uncover. Our adventure beneath the great Gothic station was concluded, but its echoes would resonate through many cases to come. A reminder that in the pursuit of truth, each answer reveals new questions, and each mystery solved opens the door to greater mysteries still waiting in the darkness. Thus ended the case of the shadow beneath St. Pancras, not with complete resolution, but with the profound understanding that some puzzles extend far beyond their apparent boundaries, challenging us to expand our conception of what lies hidden beneath the surface of the world we think we know. Spring arrived in London with its customary blend of tentative sunshine and persistent drizzle, transforming the sooty facades of Baker Street into something approaching cheerfulness. The months following our extraordinary encounter beneath St. Pancras had settled into familiar rhythms, Holmes alternating between periods of intense activity and those stretches of contemplative restlessness that drove him to his chemical apparatus or the melancholy strains of his violin. Yet I observed that he maintained an unusual interest in railway engineering journals and correspondence with surveyors whose names I recognized from Penhaligon's portfolio. It was on a mild April morning that the final thread of our subterranean mystery presented itself. Mrs. Hudson delivered a single envelope with her usual efficiency, though her troubled expression suggested something unsettling about the plain missive bearing no return address and postmarked simply London Central. Holmes examined the letter with characteristic thoroughness, noting the quality of the cream-colored paper, the precision of the typed address, and a faint scent of pipe tobacco that clung to the envelope. When he finally withdrew the single sheet within, his eyebrows rose in that expression of pleased recognition that indicated a significant development. "Most illuminating, Watson," he murmured, passing the letter across. "Our invisible adversaries have decided to make contact." The message from the shadows. The communication was brief and typed with mechanical precision. "Mr. Holmes, your intervention beneath St. Pancras demonstrated admirable deduction and appropriate discretion. However, you have glimpsed only fragments of a much larger design. The phenomena you encountered represent careful stewardship of forces that predate recorded history. We monitor, we contain, we preserve. Should circumstances require your expertise again, contact will be made through established channels. Until then, we trust this matter remains within your considerable capacity for confidentiality." The foundation. Holmes had already risen and begun that restless pacing which indicated his mind racing through countless implications. Fascinating. An organization that openly acknowledges monitoring geological anomalies, yet operates with such secrecy that even Mycroft's extensive network has failed to detect their existence. "Could this be elaborate fabrication?" I suggested. "Some attempt to claim credit for coincidental circumstances?" "Consider the evidence methodically, Watson." Holmes moved to his filing system, withdrawing the folder containing materials from our investigation. "This letter demonstrates intimate knowledge of details never made public. More significantly, observe the typewriter used, a rare continental model whose distinctive letter E shows a characteristic flaw in the upper serif." He produced one of the technical drawings we had discovered in Vogel's workshop, pointing to marginal notations in precise type. These specifications were typed on the same machine. Vogel's operation was not independent criminal enterprise, but carefully orchestrated cover for something far more complex. The broader pattern. The implications settled over me like morning fog. Then we were being observed from the beginning. Indeed, and having demonstrated both competence and discretion, we have apparently earned limited contact with this shadowy organization. Holmes returned to his chair, steepling his fingers in contemplation. "But observe what else our investigation has revealed." He spread Penhaligon's correspondence across the table, tracing lines between seemingly unrelated locations. The late surveyors, research extended far beyond St. Pancras. Manchester, Bristol, Edinburgh. Each site shows similar architectural anomalies discovered during major construction projects. The delays were officially attributed to unstable ground, but the pattern suggests something far more deliberate. A network of such sites? Precisely. And if Blackwood's theories hold merit, our great Victorian engineering projects, stations, bridges, civic buildings, may serve functions their architects never intended. They channel the energy of modern industry into these ancient systems, maintaining some vast equilibrium we barely comprehend. The weight of knowledge. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling street where ordinary Londoners pursued their daily lives, unaware of the forces that pulsed beneath their feet. "Watson, I have built my reputation upon bringing hidden truths into the light. Yet this case has taught me that some knowledge carries responsibilities beyond mere revelation." "Then you will maintain their confidence?" "I will neither seek them out nor expose them," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic gravity. "If circumstances arise requiring their specialized knowledge, I shall not refuse consultation. But I will continue gathering evidence until I can determine whether they represent protection or control." He moved to his desk and wrote a single line. "Your message is acknowledged and understood. S.H." This he sealed in an envelope addressed simply to the Foundation and handed to me. "Watson, if you would post this at Charing Cross Station. I suspect our correspondents monitor certain locations with particular attention." The eternal mystery. That evening, as gas lamps flickered to life across London and the city settled into its nocturnal rhythms, Holmes took up his violin and began a complex fugue whose interweaving melodies seemed to mirror the labyrinthine nature of our recent adventure. "You know, Watson," he said during a pause in the music, "when you chronicle this affair, I trust you will exercise appropriate discretion. The public enjoys mysteries with clear resolution, heroes and villains neatly categorized, justice definitively served. They are less comfortable with ambiguity, with recognition that some puzzles yield only partial solutions. I shall present the facts in a manner that serves both truth and prudence," I assured him. Holmes smiled faintly and resumed playing, the melancholy strains filling our sitting room with bittersweet beauty. Outside, London continued its eternal dance of light and shadow, commerce and crime, the known and the unknown. Somewhere beneath those familiar streets, ancient stones held secrets that challenged our understanding of history itself. And somewhere in that vast metropolis, the Foundation maintained their silent vigil over mysteries that predated human memory. The case of the shadow beneath St. Pancras was closed, yet its echoes would resonate through future investigations, a reminder that the world contains depths we have scarcely begun to fathom. In solving one mystery, we had discovered the existence of countless others, each more profound than the last. Thus, I conclude this account, faithful to the facts while respecting the boundaries that wisdom demands. The greatest detective must sometimes acknowledge that complete illumination can cast shadows more troubling than the darkness it dispels. But in that acknowledgement lies perhaps the deepest truth of all, that the pursuit of knowledge, however incomplete, remains humanity's noblest endeavor. The shadow beneath St. Pancras had been illuminated, yet the greater darkness beyond remained, vast and patient, waiting for those with courage enough to venture into its depths in search of answers that might forever change our understanding of the world we call home.